Okay, now if you'll back up with me just a bit to Revelation 11, because I keep meaning to do this when I read it, and I keep forgetting, but I've tried to tell you some key verses, as you know, from each chapter that kind of helps summarize the chapter and or would be especially important to the readers, the first readers, the seven churches of Asia. And so Revelation 11, verse 15 and 16 would be, I think, some good key verses to the chapter of Revelation 11. Then the seventh angel sounded, and of course this was the sounding of the seventh trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. And the 24 elders who sat before God on their thrones fell on their faces and worshiped God. So again, this could be a very important message, as you can imagine, to the seven churches of Asia who were living under a wicked kingdom known as the Roman Empire, and to be reassured that, hey, God, all the kingdoms of this world are going to pale in comparison, and of course they're also going to eventually vanish away, whereas God's kingdom is going to stand forever. And this was again, of course, a fulfillment of Daniel 2:44, that in the days of these kings, these Roman kings, that's when God would set up his kingdom, and he did so in Acts 2, the church, which will stand forever. So Revelation 11, 15, and 16, no doubt are key verses and would be helpful, especially to the first readers, the seven churches of Asia. So last time we got into chapter 12 of Revelation, and we only dealt with the first two verses. So I'm going to go back and read those and just basically summarize a couple of things before we get into verses 3 and 4. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. So I wanted to read all those together because we have the sun, the moon, and the stars are incorporated into describing this woman, indicating that much light was emanating from her. And so, no doubt, this would be important if we understand what perhaps this woman represents as best we can tell. The fact that she has, as the New King James Version says, a garland of 12 stars. Most translations, and we pointed this out, to say a crown of 12 stars. And really it should be translated probably as crown, but the reason the New King James Version translators, I'm assuming, I don't know why, but I'm assuming that the reason why they put garland is because this was the kind of crown that wrapped around the head, and so it was a wreath of sorts. It was the Greek word Stephanos, as we mentioned, was the crown given to the victor in competition of games, like the Olympic Games. They didn't have gold medals and silver medals and bronze medals like we have. The victor wore the crown, and it was a Stephanos crown, in contrast to what we'll later see in verse 3, the diadem. And so the diadem was the royal crown in Greek. Stephanos was the crown of victory in competition. So, having said that, we get the point that the 12 stars perhaps represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And so, perhaps it is the case that this woman, by the description, is meant to point the readers to the idea that this woman was a figurative way of representing the nation of Israel. Verse 2, then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. So she's also pregnant, is the picture that we're given. And then in verse 5, we know that the child she's pregnant with would be representative of Jesus. Verse 5, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne, which of course happened to Jesus when he was raised from the dead and then ascended to heaven to sit at the right hand of the throne of God. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. But we'll come back to verse 5. But that helps us in better understanding then how this woman, who this woman is supposed to represent, It appears she's the nation of Israel. And so, as we mentioned on page 82, Summers notes that some scholars hold that the woman symbolizes Israel, who in the person of the Virgin Mary produced Christ, and that helps us to make sense throughout this chapter of what is being talked about. So, get the picture. The chapter 12 deals with three distinct visions: the woman, the child, and the dragon. Now we're going to look at the dragon in verses 3 and 4. Notice what it says. And another sign appeared in heaven. So remember verse 1, now a great sign appeared in heaven. That was the woman. Verse 3, and another sign, so in addition to the first sign, another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. There's that diadem crown. Verse 4, his tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. So verse 3 presents to us, the reader, this image of a great fiery red dragon. Now, we'll later on find out that verse 9, this dragon is the devil, Satan. But for now, just so you know, that we know this is a picture of Satan with the imagery of a dragon having 7 heads and each one having 7 crowns. Additionally, this dragon, we are told, has 10 horns. So the 7 heads and upon which are the 7 crowns, the diadems, again as it mentions there, these would indicate, having the heads and the crowns, would indicate both power and authority. Haley says that the fact there's 7 heads would indicate great, representing intelligence or wisdom even, and then the crowns representing royalty and so forth. And we know, when we put these figures together, the idea of royalty and crown and king, we know that Satan can use world leaders in his work. As we look at Matthew chapter 4, remember one of the presentations of temptation that the devil gave to Jesus is found in Matthew 4 verses 8 and 9. Again, the devil took him up on an exceeding high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these things I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. So the impression is that the devil has some influence and exerts some power over the worldly evil kingdoms in the world. And so this was the promise that the devil was trying to make to Jesus. And so we know that Satan can use world leaders in his work. The 10 horns, going back then to Revelation 12:3, the 10 horns are really reminiscent of the vision that Daniel saw of the 4th beast with 10 horns. And so again, we have this Old Testament allusion, so we're not talking about things that are really all that foreign or really all that odd or out of the ordinary, because it goes back to something that Daniel talked about. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 7, you read these words, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast. Now, if you go back to verse 1 of Daniel 7 and you read about the 4 different beasts, again, a reference to the 4 world powers that were coming, that Babylon was in power at the time of Daniel 7, and then you have the Medo-Persian kingdom, and then the Grecian kingdom, and then finally Rome in the days of Jesus. And so the 4th beast, after this I saw in the night visions, verse 7, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns. And there was another horn, a little one coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So remember, apocalyptic is found not only in the book of Revelation, but apocalyptic imagery is also found in cases and throughout the prophets, and Daniel uses quite a bit of it. And so you have the fourth beast here with the 10 horns, and this is also obviously a reference to Rome, since it is the fourth beast, the fourth kingdom in the lineage of the kingdoms as they unfolded through history. And then you can also read more about them over in Daniel chapter 7, verses 15 to 25. We did take the time to read this passage a while back. I'm not going to do that again, but I will note for you especially verse 23 to 25 of Daniel 7. Thus he said, the fourth beast, so again talking about the fourth beast, shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns, here it is again, are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall do 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, sound like the Romans, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. That time, times, and half a time is something we're going to see in Revelation 12 a little bit later as well. So these 7 heads, back to Revelation 12, these 7 heads, 7 crowns, and 10 horns most likely show Satan again influencing his power, using his influence, using Rome and its emperors to do his dirty work against Christ and eventually the church. The fact that the dragon is fiery red may represent the color of blood, and so the shedding of blood and the persecutions that were going on against the faithful servants of God, perhaps is represented by this picture of the redness of the dragon. And then verse 4 of Revelation 12 shows the power of this dragon. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Well, again, this is not a weird description or imagery, because this is a similar figure presented back in Daniel once again. In Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 and 10, we have these words written, and actually it will make more sense if you go back to verse 8. Therefore the male goat, I'm reading the right passage here, yes. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. And so, by the way, this male goat, we are told in verse 21, represents Greece, which was the kingdom right before the Roman kingdom. Daniel 8:21, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. And so we've noted that passage before as well. And so this figure that's represented here, this casting of some of the stars to the ground and trampling them, this casting down the stars, we are told in Daniel 8 verse 12 at least, represented the casting down of truth. If you go on and read in Daniel 8 verse 12, because of the transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. And so you have the stars being cast down to the ground in verse 9, and then we are told it is truth that's cast down to the ground in verse 12. And perhaps that was done, this casting down of truth was done by persecuting God's people. In verse 13 it says in Daniel 8, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices, and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot," this trampling underfoot, and so on, and this attack against the sacrifices would be, at least indirectly, a persecution against God's people. And so, putting some of these ideas together, it may be that the stars being thrown to the earth, as presented in these figures, represents the devil's historical persecution against God's people. And of course, in the Old Covenant, God's people were Israel, physical Israel. In the New Covenant, God's people are spiritual Israel, as is described in the New Testament of the church. After all, this dragon is poised, we're told in verse 4, to devour her child. So verse 4, "After the tail draws a third of the stars of heaven and throws them to the earth, the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born." So Israel's child, metaphorically speaking or figuratively speaking, would be the Messiah upon his birth. So it's interesting because really John it's not really John, it's really God in giving John this vision. But it kind of backs up a little bit, I think, historically, and shows some of the events that have transpired throughout history. And while we might look at them from one perspective, it kind of shows a different perspective. The perspective we're seeing is that the devil has been waiting for the Messiah. Back when the Messiah was born into the world, he was waiting for the Messiah to be born so that he could devour him, so that he could destroy him. And so when you think about that being pictured in that way, maybe that's the way heaven is seeing this perspective, whereas when we read about the actual historical events that go on, we can see how that could be the case, because remember, the devil tried to devour Christ when he was born. Devour in a figurative way. Remember how the devil used Herod to try to kill Jesus? Back in Matthew chapter 2, you remember Matthew 2 records the events of the Magi. The Greek word Magi usually comes over into the New King James, and King James is the wise men. Don't know how many of them there were, by the way. The wise men, and so they had come, they wanted to find out more about this Messiah, and so Herod had got wind of this. And so he wanted the wise men to tell him, what they found when they find the Messiah. And so in verse 16, when the wise men or the Magi never returned to him, in verse 16 it says, "Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men." So the devil was trying to destroy Jesus as soon as he came into the world. Not long after. This would have been a little while after Jesus was in the world, but he wasn't in the world very long when this happened. And so we see how that from our perspective in history, this is what Herod did. But from the devil's perspective, it's really him trying to devour the Christ and destroy him. And so, although when you look at this figure back in Revelation 12, you see this pregnant woman, hasn't got a lot of strength, typically when you think about a woman who's carrying a child, she gets tired, she gets sick, and, she has all the strain and stress from carrying the child. She's not going to be a very formidable, opponent. And this child, as soon as it's born, it's innocent, it's helpless, it needs, a mother to take care of it and so forth. And so from that perspective, you see, well, this dragon, I mean, as it's portrayed to us, far more strong, far more powerful than a pregnant woman and then eventually her newborn baby. And although the dragon seems more powerful than a vulnerable pregnant woman and her defenseless child, we see that would make God not be in the picture. And so God will protect them. And so then in verses 5 and 6, we see the child is born. Any questions or comments up to verse 4 so far?
I saw the number 7, then that was the number 666,
That's going to be in chapter 13, 666. But what does 7 typically represent? The number? Completeness, perfection. So we never need to forget about what the symbolism is in the number here either. So we have this fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. Now, it's interesting that the red dragon represents the devil, but thinking about what you said, notice it doesn't have 777, it has 7710, which 10 is usually a representative of who? Mankind. Right, 10 fingers, 10 toes. And so we have man and his part in this interjected in this vision, because obviously if it represents the devil using Rome, that would entail men being involved. But
also, too, where it's kind of hinted that here the dragon is represented back in Matthew 2, where Herod was trying to give us what power he did not have, because he had no idea where Jesus was.
right.
He had to rely on trickery and all of that to begin to locate.
Right.
He didn't even know exactly the age, and so part of that was told him to lie.
Right. Yeah, so in all the ways in which the devil might appear, killing children, 2 years old and under, that's horrific. That's devious, that sounds very powerful, but in all the best efforts of the devil, he can't overcome God. All right, verses 5 and 6, Revelation 12. So, the pregnancy is over. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So verse 5 portrays the woman, of course, giving birth to the child. Israel, in the person of Mary, gives birth to a male child. We're told it's a male child, in verse 5. And this child is to, quote, rule all nations with a rod of iron. Well, again, we have another Old Testament allusion. Description is here a reference to what God said of his son in Psalm 2. And Psalm 2 is a very messianic psalm. Psalm, in other words, referring to the Messiah. In Psalm 2, verse 7, I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. Notice verse 9, you shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. And so this description is an obvious reference to what God said of his son, and finds its fulfillment in Christ. Going back to Revelation 12, verse 5, the latter part of verse 5 fast forwards, so to speak, from the birth of the child to beyond Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, to the point of when Christ ascended back to heaven. Because it says, after he's born, he's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron, rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God in his throne. Well, that happened, of course, after Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected, and then ascended back to heaven. And so again, if you go back to Daniel, Daniel also sees this vision very similarly. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, and this is a passage we also have noted in the past. Daniel says, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, coming back to God, in other words, after the resurrection. And they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. Well, we know the kingdom, of course, was established on the earth on the day of Pentecost in the form of the church. That didn't happen until Jesus went back to heaven. That all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. In the body of Christ, neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, so on. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. And so again, Daniel foresees, I should say, in this prophecy, in this vision, Jesus already ascending back to God long before he even came into the world. And then, of course, you read this in relationship to Acts chapter 1 as well, verses 9 through 11. And this is after Jesus gives some final instructions to his apostles in verse 8. And then in verse 9, now when he had spoken these things, while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven. And so again, you have this picture of the child being caught up to God and to his throne, and we know that took place when Jesus ascended back to the Father after his resurrection. And so all through Jesus' life, the devil tried to devour Christ and his work. And he may have thought that he was successful when he got Jesus nailed to the cross. But when the child was caught up to God after that, he died, but he didn't stay dead. Well, Satan obviously lost the battle. Verse 6 shows the woman fleeing to the wilderness after the child has ascended back to heaven. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God. And so even though the child was no longer there, he had gone back up and he had ascended back to heaven, the woman had not been abandoned by God. The woman that gave birth to the child, Israel. She has a place prepared by God. And I don't want to go too far off here, but this has always been an interesting study to me. But you know, Jesus went to make preparations for the church when he ascended back to heaven. Jesus came to make preparations for the church to come on the day of Pentecost. And how many people go to John 14 and think, well, Jesus went back to prepare heaven? Remember those words in John 14? Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions, literally, if you look at your footnotes, if you're reading the New King James, dwellings or dwelling places. In my Father's house are many dwellings or dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. And then notice Jesus' words. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Years ago, I had a preacher friend of mine who been preaching for well over 40 years. He said, you know, would Jesus go to prepare heaven? Is that what this means? I mean, you may have heard this and say, we know Jesus is in heaven right now preparing a place for us. And that's typically how I have heard this passage presented. But a friend of mine, a preacher friend of mine, said, you know, it makes a whole lot more sense. Jesus was going back to heaven to prepare a place known as the church. That's why he went back to heaven. To prepare a place for you. You know, he's talking to the apostles here. Prepare a place for you. And so when you think about Jesus going back to heaven to prepare a place, it does seem a little odd that heaven wouldn't already be prepared. does God not know, how vast heaven must be to accommodate all those of his faithful? I think God knows that. But it's an interesting study, because what does he say? In my Father's house. What is the Father's house? It's the church. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 3. Remember when Paul was giving the qualifications of elders, and he wrote to Timothy saying, I might be delayed in coming to you. 1 Timothy 3, verse 14. These things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. But if I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is what? The church of the living God, the pillar and ground of truth. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. There's plenty of room in the church, isn't there? For anybody who wants to obey the gospel, doesn't matter your social status, your racial status, there's plenty of dwelling places. So it's something to think about, because it's not something that we typically hear. But again, if Jesus is going away to prepare a place, the immediate place that Jesus was going to prepare, obviously, was the church, because the church had not yet been established on the earth. Something to think about. And so remember that this place, then going back to Revelation 12, God has this place prepared for her. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So this place is prepared, where this woman will be taken care of, in the form of that phrase, that they should feed her there. Well, during the same amount of time that the two witnesses were prophesying, that was also 1,260 days. Remember in Revelation 11 and verse 3, when the preaching of, if we understood the vision correctly, the apostles and the saints, I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days. So the apostles and the early church are pictured here perhaps as the two witnesses. And so they're doing the preaching, and the early church was continuing to preach when this woman, Israel, was seeking a place for protection. And so the only place, if you're following along with my notes on page 84, the only place that fleshly Israel could have protection and sustenance is in the place that God prepared, which is the church. So the woman being portrayed as fleshly Israel, from which the child was born, is now beginning to merge into the woman portrayed as spiritual Israel, which would be the church. As one man even, concludes in summarizing this, the pregnant woman who gives birth in the early part of the chapter is fleshly Israel. The woman who flees from her enemies in the latter part of the chapter is spiritual Israel, i.e. the church. And so remember, we know that the church is often pictured in the New Testament as spiritual Israel. Questions or comments up to verse 8? Wait, no. Verse 6.
Where it refers to all nations, to me that's timeless. That's the nations of that time, as well as the nations in the future, and the rod of iron being the word of God.
Mm-hmm. Right. You're right. Jesus will, he's ruling now on his throne. He's the King of Kings. You can't have a king without a kingdom. He's ruling now over the nations, even though the nations don't realize it. He is. And of course, that goes back to the key verse, Revelation 1:15. The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. And he shall reign forever and ever. Okay. Verses 7 through 9. We have war in heaven. War in heaven. Notice what it says. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So not happy with the outcome of the battle, in trying to devour the child as soon as the child is born. In verse 7 we find the dragon, the devil, pictured as taking the war to heaven. So as I wanted to read actually a section here in Summers' book, because I have part of it in the notes on page 84, where he says this is apocalyptic imagery, and then it follows some things. But I'm gonna go back and kind of bring things kind of bring some other things into this which kind of relate. Maybe I'm not really going back and adding anything. These are things that we've kind of talked about, but it summarizes it. Let's put it that way. When the child was born, the dragon made his effort to destroy it. But God's protective care was exercised, and the child was caught up to heaven in safety. Thus, in a brief statement, we see the providential care which attended Christ during the days of his sojourn upon the earth. From the early days of his childhood, the devil tried to destroy him. We saw that. Through the years of his ministry, those efforts continued. At the last, the devil appeared to be the victor when Christ was nailed to the cross and placed in the tomb. But the power of God was able to give him the victory even over death. He was raised from the grave and caught up to the very throne of God. The devil lost the first battle in the conflict. And then it picks up with the quote I have here in your notes on page 84. This is apocalyptic imagery. A battle is raging. The scene shifts from earth to heaven, then back to earth in the course of affairs. So in the pageantry, we see the devil, unsuccessful in his efforts to destroy the Christ on the earth, as he tries even to invade heaven to destroy the child. So it's as if, okay, so he wanted to devour the child, he wanted to destroy Jesus the whole time he was here on this earth, and when he was unsuccessful, it's if, in a fit of rage, he charges into heaven and tries to go after Christ there. I mean, that seems to be the picture that we get here in Revelation 12:7. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon. So the dragon is now pictured as coming back from the earth up into heaven. So, but don't miss sight of the phrase in the notes I have. This is apocalyptic imagery. This is not literal. But we're getting a perspective again of these things from heaven's perspective that we wouldn't have if we didn't have the book of Revelation. And so we have war breaking out in heaven. We have Michael and his angels, Michael the archangel that's mentioned in some places, fighting with the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. And so again, we see this imagery being used to portray certain things in the mind of John. And so we see how desperate and evil and relentless the devil is. And so in this verse, we find something that we might never imagine, a war in heaven. Again, this is not a literal war. It's a symbolic one representing the conflict occurring between God and the devil historically. That, God and the devil have been at odds with each other ever since going back to the beginning, right? Genesis chapter 3 and the sin that entered into the world. Michael the archangel is pictured as leading an army of angels against the dragon and his angels. And by the way, and I'll list these for you here in the notes on page 85, Michael appears a few times in the scriptures, especially during the time of Daniel. So it's interesting how many times we go back to Daniel in talking about Revelation chapter 12. But in Daniel chapter 10, verse 13, he's often pictured as a prince in the book of Daniel. It says in Daniel 10:13, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the kings of Persia. And then in verse 21, of Daniel 10, but I will tell you what is noted in the scripture of truth. No one upholds me against these except Michael, your prince. And then in Daniel 12 and verse 1, at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time, and at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. So Michael is mentioned a few times, I should say, especially during the time of Daniel. Although he was active against, we're told, the devil in another occasion in Jude. In Jude verse 9, this is how we know he's referred to as Michael the archangel. And so in Jude verse 9 it says, "Yet Michael the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring against him a reviling accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke you." Now that's something we would never know about if Jude had not written about that. And so Michael is pictured as, this powerful archangel in this battle that we're told is being portrayed in heaven. Verse 8 records the defeat of the dragon in the battle. Again, they did not prevail. If you're reading from the New American Standard, and they were not strong enough. So they weren't strong enough to defeat Michael and those with him. So they could not prevail, they weren't strong enough, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. And so the dragon and his angels could not prevail. The devil and his forces, in other words, are no match for God and his forces. No surprise there. And furthermore, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. The devil and his angels may have once had access to heaven. At least that's kind of the picture that we're given in Job. Remember in Job, when Satan tried to destroy Job? And in Job 1 verse 6, it says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." And so the sons of God typically are understood to be a day when the angels had come before God, and Satan also appeared. So again, I don't know how that all works, so the devil having access, but again, I'm just going by what Job said. A lot of things we don't know about the devil. But we see that the devil is eternally separated from God once and for all when it says there was no place found for them in heaven any longer. And then verse 9 gives a certain finality to the war scene in heaven. "So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with..." Now, let me caution you. This is why I especially wanted to bring Summers' words in. He says this paragraph must be interpreted in its context in Revelation rather than in relation to obscure Old Testament passages or Milton's book Paradise Lost. This is not a historical account of the original state of the devil and his fall from that state. It is apocalyptic imagery to present the picture of the devil's efforts to destroy the Christ and his people. Thus, the devil has lost 2 battles so far in the conflict. He was unable to destroy the Christ on the earth when he was born. He was unsuccessful in his efforts to invade heaven to destroy the Christ as well. Now, as we will see in Revelation 12, he turns to a third part of his campaign. He will exercise his wrath on the woman who produced the Christ. So I say that to caution anyone who may be tempted to come to Revelation 12 and see, well, see, here we have the record of how the devil was cast out of heaven, originally, and that's how he became the devil. And no, this is not a record of that. This is in the context of the devil following the Christ. Again, imagery, not literally. Trying to go and get Christ even after he ascended to heaven is the picture that we are given here. But again, it's a figurative one, and it's not to be taken literally. The point that we're supposed to get is the devil has always been at war with God, and And he's always tried everything he can to destroy God's people. Questions or comments?
Back in 6 there, the reference to 1,260 days, is that Christ's ministry?
Ministry, is that what you said? That seems to be, well, of course, 1,260 is 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days, as is represented here, and it's also represented as time times and half a time. And so this seems to be a figure going back to the preaching of the gospel, back from Revelation 11:3, when the two witnesses, when we studied that, were portrayed as perhaps the apostles preaching, and then, of course, the apostles died out, but the early church continued to preach. And so this place is prepared, if we've identified it properly as the church, would mean the church is continuing to preach. So it would be, to answer your question, it would be after Christ's ministry, if that makes sense. Did you have a question, Dan?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, when it points out that we've always had God, even when Christ went to heaven, prepare a home for the church, instead of say, that was the church.
He's still after us. He can use, the devil can use a lot of tools and even a lot of people, even within the church, like you said, sometimes, if we let him in the church. Yes. But again, a lot of imagery and a lot of symbolism. But again, I think the takeaway is 1 Peter 5, verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, is a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. He is relentless. If you don't come away from Revelation 12 with seeing the devil is relentless, then you've missed an important part of that chapter, because he obviously wants to destroy God's people. He wanted to destroy the Christ, and he wants to destroy all of us. And so all the more we need to be vigilant.
So we not have a record.
Todd asks, do we not have a record of the beginning of the devil? Well, at least not an explicit record. We can kind of put some things together and get a implicit record of the devil. And I'm not going to take up too much time because I know our time's up, but to answer your question, when did God create everything? Okay, in Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything that was created appears to have been created then. By implication, all other living things, even though not specified, apparently even the angels at that time. Because in the beginning there was God. It doesn't say anything about anybody else. In the beginning, God created them. So we have the angels. So there's only really 3 types of living beings. So we have to use kind of a process of elimination, right? God is a living being. The angels are spirits, they're living beings. And then there's man. He's a living being. I don't know of any other living being, those 3. So we try to figure out now where does the devil fit into those living beings, because we know the devil's a living being. Is he God? No. God has 3 qualities that the devil doesn't possess. Number 1, he's omniscient. He's all-knowing. The devil doesn't know everything. If he did, he would be a lot more powerful, but he doesn't know everything. He would have known where Jesus was in Matthew 2 if he knew everything. He's not omnipresent. In other words, he's not everywhere. He can't be everywhere at the same time like God is. And so, in fact, in Revelation 20, and also Jesus spoke about binding the strong man. Well, if someone can be bound, they can't be everywhere. So obviously, Satan can't be omnipresent. So he's not omniscient, he's not omnipresent, and he's not omnipotent, all-powerful. His power is limited. What power he has is only what God allows him to have. So we know he's not God because he doesn't possess any of those qualities. He's not man. He has no flesh. So the only thing left that he was or could be is that final category of spiritual beings, which are angels. The Bible never comes out and says he's an angel, but again, by process of elimination, it appears he was an angel. And so evidently he started out as good, because when God created everything, everything was what? Good. It was very good. So if the person who, and I like to put it this way, if the being that became known as Satan, because Satan means adversary, God wouldn't create someone evil. If the person who became, or the being that became known as Satan, started out as good, which we gather that he must have been, then he must have fallen at some point. And the only passage that I have really ever found to help me with that is in 1 Timothy chapter 3, and then we'll stop there. But in 1 Timothy chapter 3, when Paul was giving the qualifications of elders. And he says in verse 2, a bishop or an elder, they must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? And then he says this about them, not a novice or a new convert, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. So did this being who eventually became known as the devil become so prideful that he fell? That's the best I can do. So I say implicitly, yeah, there is, I guess, some pieces we can put together, but the Bible never comes out and tells us the history of the devil, or the one we know is the devil. All right. Number 947, correct, Tim? 947 will be the invitation song. As we go on and read Revelation chapter 12, we're going to find that those who are able to overcome the wiles, the evils, the temptations of the devil are found in Revelation 12, verse 11. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Those who were faithful in the first century, among those that are being talked about among the seven churches, the way they overcame, first and foremost, was through the blood of the Lamb. That's not changed. It's the way we still overcome the devil and all the sinfulness in this world is still by the blood of the Lamb. And so tonight, if you have not been washed in the blood of the Lamb, you haven't had your sins washed away, in other words, through baptism, Acts 22:16, where we get in contact with the blood, because remember, we're baptized into Jesus' death, Romans 6:3 and 4. And it's in Jesus' death where he shed his blood, John chapter 19. And so, if Jesus shed his blood in his death, and we have to be baptized into his death, Romans 6:3 and 4, that's where we contact the blood. And when we're baptized into his death, we then rise to walk in newness of life. And that doesn't describe you tonight, then why not tonight? Believing Jesus is the Son of God, repenting, confessing his name, and being baptized, why not be able to overcome through the blood of the Lamb? And maybe tonight that you are a Christian, you've overcome initially this sinful world by the blood of the Lamb, but you know the world wants to pull you back. The devil wants you back, wants you're free of sin. And sometimes he wins a battle over us. We sin. But the good news is we can repent of that, we can confess that, and God will forgive. And so tonight, if we can help you in obeying him, would you come and make that known as we stand and sing this invitation song?
Jesus, calling me home, calling today, calling today. Why
I'm gonna go with a big number. So 42 here tonight in class 6, online 13, for a total of 61. So there's a difference in count of about 3, so, or 2 actually. So anyway, somewhere around that area. Let's continue to remember those in prayer that we mentioned tonight. And Kenneth, if you'll lead us in closing prayer.
Shall we? Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you, Lord, for the new chances you give us to attend our service. Pray, Father, that you bless those that have been mentioned as being sick. Pray, Lord, that you go with us as we go to our homes. You forgive us for our sins. Keep us safe. In Christ's name. Amen. Amen.
How you doing tonight? Oh, I'm fine. Hey, girl, how you going?
It's not. It's only for